This episode of the Media Leader podcast was edited by our production partner, Trisonic. For a full range of audio, media buying, and creative services, including podcast production, check out trisonic.co.uk.
In the UK in 2025, retail media will actually outpace total TV for the first time. It'll be larger than total TV.
Welcome to the Media Leader podcast. I'm Jack Benjamin. We are quickly approaching the end of the year, and so it's time again for the release of end-of-year global ad spend forecast reports. Yes, each year we're inundated with a number of forecasts, and GroupM is one of many agencies to produce a report. Theirs is titled This Year, Next Year, and it's required reading for anyone looking to keep tabs on the global health of the ad industry, including us at the Media Leader. And on the surface, the industry does appear in rude health. GroupM upwardly revised its global ad revenue forecast for 2024 and now expects global ad revenue to surpass $1 trillion for the first time this year. And that's excluding U.S. political advertising, which itself totaled $15.1 billion. Meanwhile, despite loads of uncertainty this year regarding the UK's political and economic future, the UK ad market grew 8.3%. Digital remains dominant with big growth drivers including retail media, and meanwhile, streaming TV continues to grow at pace. An influx of new startups in the AI space could also provide a future boost to ad expenditure in future economies. But of course, there are uncertainties abound around global trade under a new Trump administration, and other geopolitical tensions remain unpredictable as we look ahead to 2025. You can read our full coverage of the This Year, Next Year report on themedialeader.co.uk, but joining me on the podcast to unpack the report and all its implications, I'm delighted to welcome back Kate Scott-Dawkins, the author of This Year, Next Year, and GroupM's Global President of Business Intelligence. Kate, thanks for being here and for your work on the report.
Thank you so much.
I know this week is always a doozy for you, and I've got a bevy of questions to add to your plate, so I appreciate the time. And I should also mention before we begin that you'll be speaking about the This Year, Next Year report at our Future of TV Advertising Global event in London on Wednesday. So if any listeners out there are attending, be sure to check out Kate's session to learn more beyond our conversation today.
Great use of the word bevy, by the way. I'm a big language person, so...
Bevy's a big word. I love the word bevy. First, Kate, why don't you take me through some of the key top lines from the report? If there's just, two or three big things that you think people should know right off the bat.
Yeah, sure. I think the biggest is just the growth number for 2024. We're wrapping up this year. I know lots of folks are interested in next year too, but we came in at 9.5% annual ad revenue growth for 2024, which is really, the highest other than a couple of peak years, 2021, obviously, 2019, but it's a big number in terms of ad revenue growth. And that's excluding U.S. political advertising. If we include U.S. political advertising, more than $15 billion a year, we're at 10.7% growth for the year. So pretty astounding for an industry that is, now $1 trillion to be growing that quickly.
So that sounds pretty rosy, which I was actually kind of surprised to hear because I feel like there's been a lot of uncertainty this year with so many different elections looking back at 2024, and then also uncertainty looking forward ahead into especially a second Trump presidency next year. The tariff plan has been sort of widely criticized by economists as something that could spike inflation, maybe harm global trade and growth. I understand that a lot of these things are hard to predict. Same goes for other geopolitical uncertainties like we've seen in the past week in South Korea, in France. But I'm curious, looking ahead as, not to say that it doesn't look rosy looking back at 2024, but I'm just curious how you feel looking ahead given all of these uncertainties.
Yeah, so the forecast for next year is 7.7% growth globally. And I think that is testament to sort of how normal uncertainty has become in a way. If you think we've been dealing with a certain amount of geopolitical instability or uncertainty for really the better part of the last 5 years at least, right? We had the pandemic, government changes, we have conflict in Ukraine and the Middle East, and these are things that, sadly, I don't want to call that normal in any sense of the word. The uncertainty that advertisers are dealing with, I think, has existed and will continue to exist into next year. And we are, the advertising economy is going to sort of continue despite that and continue to, help brands find consumers and for their products and services. And so that's partly what's underlying that 7.7% growth rate for 2025. Continue dealing with uncertainty.
But would you concede that that there's a potentially more negative outlook if things really do start to go bad? Or on the opposite end, are there positive signals that we could look for to see early next year if that growth could be upgraded? You've upgraded the 2024 report now multiple times this past year.
Yeah. Look, I think one of the things maybe why we feel the uncertainty so much as well, right, is because of how interconnected globally the world economy is. And that is absolutely true of advertising as well. So that, what happens in one market influences the global news story and influences global movements of media and trade, maybe more so than it did before we had experienced this like real rise of globalization over the last decade. And that globalization is something we talk about a lot in our reporting because it means that the biggest commerce players are generally the largest commerce players globally and not just within their individual market or their individual region. The same for media players, right? You're going to have Netflix globally and Amazon globally and Google and Meta globally. And so I think that is, the trend that we're going to see continue. I think on the downside, the risk to that is to the extent that globalization is curtailed, and this is something that the IMF talks about in their October report as well, that they don't see a complete sort of deglobalization, but that we could see trade, more aligned within blocks rather than across blocks. If you think about a block in sort of the US and Europe, another block of sort of China, Russia, Iran, that could disrupt things alongside greater geopolitical conflict in terms of disrupting supply chains or movement of goods and services, right? I think that's certainly our downside risk against our base case. On the upside, I think you have a huge amount of innovation and research and new tools and services that are emerging really off the back of AI and the rise of large language models and GPT transformers. And that is part of our upside scenario. So we are expecting at some point to get new advertisers into the space or increasing advertising from established players around their AI products and services. So this might be new companies creating GPT wrappers, right, using large language models, but also folks like Microsoft and Amazon and Google that are really heavily investing in this and then want to make sure they have their market share and their products reaching consumers. So that I think is likely to be a boon for advertising. We're not 100% sure of the timing of that. It's going to depend on a lot of factors, but I expect that to be a source of upside over the next 1 to 5 years.
You mentioned a number of the big tech companies already. I think it's important to note, and the report makes note of it, and we talked about it last year as well, the consolidation of ad revenues to sort of really just 5 key players. Google, Meta, ByteDance, Amazon, Alibaba are expected to receive more than half of all ad revenue in 2024, according to the report. Most of that is coming from small and medium-sized advertisers. I'm curious if you see this level of competition among few large players as a healthy development. I know that they're competing really strongly against each other, but it feels like the industry is really consolidated in a way that I don't know is particularly healthy, but you might have a different view.
No, I think, look, our interest as GroupM is in the health of our clients, right? We want to do the best thing for our clients as advertisers. In that sense, I think competition is really a good thing. Right? Competition that drives innovation, competition that can drive benefits to advertisers in terms of pricing or any number of things, but really innovation, right? We want to see innovation in the space in terms of technology, content, any of those areas. I think that sense competition is good, and we would welcome it from any and all sources. What I think is increasingly difficult in this age of AI is the extent to which there's a sense that maybe you need large resources. Maybe that's capital expenditure expense to be able to support that kind of innovation in a world of AI, where you need data centers or large numbers of chips to do that, right? So I think that's one of the things that we're watching in terms of where this consolidation goes next and where those pockets of innovation and competition can come from. But where we are today, yes, I think that consolidation is a big focus of the report still.
I'm curious about regulatory measures against some of these companies as well. Google was found to be a monopolist on search, potentially will be found to be a monopolist on ad tech, could even be broken up. There's more regulations seem to be coming for Apple, Meta, US TikTok ban, that's up in the air, but Australia's just passed an under 16 social media ban, which I have no idea how they're going to enforce, but at least it was passed. So I'm curious, do regulatory measures impact any, especially when the industry does seem to be a bit more consolidated? Is that a consideration as well?
Yeah. You could spend an entire 80 pages probably just hashing out all the regulations, but I think I would bore of that, and probably the readers would as well, right? So we haven't done that. We do cover them. And it feels like, every day there is something new happening, right? So do you want to be too prescriptive about it because the situation changes the next week and then it's outdated? But yes, all of those things are happening. I think the swell of regulation right now around, the health and well-being of children is extremely important. I think it's really important for advertisers in the industry to look at that and pay attention to that, really. And so I expect that to be a continued part of the dialogue over the next year. The antitrust pieces, again, I think in terms of benefit to advertisers, on the whole, all else being equal, competition is a good thing. And I also expect that these companies, again, have the resources to adapt and grow, and who knows what we'll see, right? I mean, the initial ruling for Microsoft back in the late 90s, early 2000s was a breakup, and that didn't end up happening. We may see a similar thing today. There are probably some things like the banning of buying default search mode. I expect that's probably the most likely one to go forward. But that just means, any search browser like Chrome has to prove itself to consumers and earn that position. And I think companies will be intent on doing that.
Breaking the forecast down by market and looking at the UK market specifically for all our listeners in the UK, 2024 seemed on the surface to be a year that was challenged by a lot of uncertainties. The general election came as a bit of a surprise in the summer. The October budget seemed to weigh on confidence, at least earlier in the autumn. But your report writes that the UK ad market will grow 8.3% this year to reach 53.2 billion. So I'm curious how we should consider the health of the UK media market specifically, and sort of what's driving the growth in what is Europe's largest ad market.
Yeah, it has outperformed this year and expectations for next year as well, some of the other large European markets like Germany and France. I will say that number is US dollars. So 2024 growth 8.3% to 39.7 billion pounds.
Okay, right,
and
of course.
Further 7.0% next year in 25. So still quite optimistic. I think some of that is born out of what we've seen. We track, the largest global media owners, and when those companies are putting up double-digit growth figures, and you look at the UK, and the UK is already 80% digital, that has to drive growth, right? That's just the math behind it in a sense. So, and the IMF has upgraded their expectations for the UK as well, right? So I think, yes, again, there's uncertainty everywhere, and things are still progressing. There's still a lot of interest in technology. The UK has really been a proponent of looking to AI and technology as a source of future growth. And so I think that will continue, right? The government has voiced support of that. And we've, again, seen tremendous growth from the largest digital sellers of advertising. And the UK is already so indexed into digital already that meant a more positive outlook for that market.
Are there other channels as well that the UK is sort of over-indexing on or otherwise leading on?
Out-of-home growth is expected to be pretty good as well for the UK this year and next, looking at 7.4% growth this year, 24, and 6.4% next year. And streaming, I think, too, pretty good growth of streaming. 2025 is expected to be 1.4 billion pounds just for streaming TV in the UK. That's growth of nearly 20%, and expecting it to make up about 30% of total TV in the market. So that and retail media really, I think, are the stories of pretty much every market. In the UK in 2025, retail media will actually outpace total TV for the first time. It'll be larger than total TV.
I mean, I want to unpack that a little bit, because that's pretty astounding for a media channel that's only a few years old, right? So who are the main beneficiaries? First of all, I guess, why is the UK further ahead than other countries in terms of pushing retail media? And then who are those beneficiaries, and how are they building out their propositions?
I mean, I think there's some aspect of it that is the UK further ahead in retail media, and some aspects that are more related to TV in that market. The BBC is still a huge player, and that is ad-free, and so that's a little bit different than the US TV market, which has been really heavily ad-supported, pay TV heavy, since for the last couple of decades, right?
Right.
So I think it has to do with both the retail side of the equation and the TV side of the equation. Amazon certainly is the largest piece of that retail media number. But then you have folks like Tesco and Sainsbury that are doing a lot with their shopper data and making that available. The sophistication, targeting, optimization that they're providing to advertisers in this closed loop attribution environment has, I think, been very attractive, especially for retail endemic advertisers like CPG. So the next trick in terms of unlocking more future growth is going to be what's the selling point for non-endemic advertisers as well.
I want to talk more about other media channels as well, but first, just one other market that I was curious to know a little bit more about is China. It's felt like China's been very volatile. I mean, post, during pandemic. Is a recovery in the Chinese market expected to occur in terms of, I guess, is consumer spending that drives growth, but also are there other ways that growth could be driven in China that could maybe boost total global growth, especially among some of these big brands that are advertising globally next year?
That's a great question. Again, back to the fact that everything is connected globally, right?
Right.
So what happens in one market absolutely has knock-on impact in other markets as well. Yes. So we are still seeing sluggish consumer expenditure in China. I think lower confidence in that market as to the property market and just expectations of future growth, despite some of the stimulus plans that have been announced by the government. Now, that could change, absolutely. The Chinese economy in general tends to be more driven by exports rather than consumer expenditure, at least to the extent that you compare that with something like the US or the UK, where consumer expenditure is a larger portion of GDP. So if, consumer spending was to pick up, I think that would absolutely benefit the market. You might have CPG, beauty, luxury brands that have been seeing slowing growth in that market or even declines in that market start to pick up again, right? Maybe to capitalize on some of that pent-up demand. So I think you could see growth in the China market. Now, there are a couple of things. Maybe that has an inverse relationship with some growth in the US, where some of those large cross-border advertisers like a Temu or a Shein maybe refocus somewhat on domestic demand and less so on international expansion. Not saying that's going to happen, but it's one of those interactions or interconnections that you could imagine in that situation. The other thing with the growth in China, we're actually still expecting better than 10% growth in China next year, not necessarily because we expect consumer spending to be up that much by that same amount, but because more and more activity in China is transitioning into what we would see as measured media channels. So things that we might not have measured before that were offline sales activities that are moving into platforms like Douyin, which is TikTok's sister app in China, or Red, Xiaohongshu. That is creating growth because we are now capturing it. It's now, media revenue. It may have existed before, but we weren't necessarily measuring it in the same way. And so that's translating to growth, even though it's not necessarily, consumer expenditure growth.
So maybe not a growth in GDP, but just a sort of shuffling around of different revenues into media.
Exactly. Yeah, because GDP, I mean, the Chinese government has said the target is around 5. I think that's where they're around that in terms of what we've seen in the past couple of quarters. So that's the difference between GDP growth and advertising growth there.
This episode of the Media Leader Podcast is brought to you by TiVo OS, the content-first independent smart TV operating system that's bringing new monetization opportunities to market. Find out more at TiVo.com. You mentioned TV already. I think one of the big things that emerged this year in terms of all of the broadcasters, be it at Cannes or in other conversations, sort of really leaning into sports is extremely important, be it for their linear product, of course, but also increasingly for streaming services like Netflix buying Christmas NFL games and a big boxing event that apparently didn't go too well for Mike Tyson. I didn't watch that. I'm curious, do you think the increased importance of sports, I guess, what are the knock-on effects of that? Because you start to see sports rights costs climbing, and I think the concern for a long time has been that the more traditional broadcasters, which aren't big tech companies that are making loads of revenue from other sources, might not be able to keep up with that expenditure. And I'm curious how you view the sort of changing sports landscape for TV.
I think it could be hugely exciting, right? We've seen from audiences a desire to watch sports on TV and TV broadly, streaming, linear, whatever, right? There is something about being a part of that moment altogether that we have moved away from in the last decade because media has become so atomized. Not even just different households where I'm watching Netflix and, someone else is watching Amazon, someone else is watching the ITV, that everyone used to kind of watch the same show at the same time. And then there was excitement around that, or there was chatter around that because it was everyone at the same time watching something, experiencing something together. And we have really moved away from that. Even in the same household, you might be sat next to your partner on the couch, each watching something different, right?
Yep.
And sports has really been the antithesis of that, where people are still coming together and watching something at the same time. The Olympics was massive this summer, right? It drove a lot of ad revenue for Comcast globally and in the US. And I think what's exciting about the potential future of that is to expand beyond sort of just the football viewer in the UK, the American football viewer in the US, into more women's leagues, into things like rugby and cricket that have massive followings in other parts of the world, and that I think would have big followings and big audiences in additional markets were they to have the kind of investment and sponsorship and airtime that some of these other large sports have. So I think we could see it being, a larger share of viewing and having more available then. You could see that maybe benefiting additional stations, networks, channels that could pick up on some of those other rights.
Yeah, I got really into rugby sevens this year by surprise. Never watched that before. Really
so
fun
great.
at the Olympics. It is very good. I would like to see more of it. If any broadcasters
My husband's a
out
South
there
African, so rugby is
okay.
It's been a good couple of years in our household.
Yeah, for sure. The report also included some rather, I would say, sort of dire forecasts for especially the print market. You write by 2029, globally, total print advertising revenue, inclusive of traditional and digital formats across newspapers and magazines, will represent just 3.0% of total ad revenue, down from 10% in 2019. I believe it was wasn't the market share was near like 50% at the start of the century?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the other traditional media channels like out of home, and which you mentioned is good, doing well in the UK, and audio is also much more robust. So I guess I'm curious, is there anything that publishing could be doing to start regaining some share of those ad dollars, or is it essentially a lost cause to other mediums?
Someone who reads news every day, I still get the physical version of the Financial Times on the weekend, so I'm a big fan of paper and news, and so it is hard to see some of these really stark share declines over the last 25 years. I think part of that has come from just the harder to differentiate and separate from substitute that come out of the digital world, right? So out of home, it it hasn't been the case where just anyone can buy a billboard and put it up, but anyone can, film something and talk about a subject as if they're an expert, and maybe they are an expert in that area, and they can put it on YouTube or TikTok or whatever, right? Or post about it on any number of social platforms, and I think that's been an easier substitute, unfortunately, for the news media, right? And so figuring out how to manage that, I think, it was also one of the earlier forms to move to digital. It's been talked about by numerous other people around, things were once free and now aren't. And how do you maintain advertising revenue through that transition? How do you get people to log in such that you have this audience you can then monetize via advertising? And so it's really been, some of those challenges are unique to news in the way that they haven't been to something like out of home. And, I think audio is an interesting one, but out of home has kept its share better than most. I don't know, but I think it's hugely important. And I have spoken to advertisers in the past. I continue to do so about the importance of continuing to invest in news and in quality journalism, and making sure that we, as just an audience in general, taking off my advertising hat, it's just important, I think. So trying to continue to support that via advertisers and not have like mass exclusion lists that block news when we haven't seen any data to suggest that audiences have a negative connotation of seeing an advertiser next to a news story. So I think it's continuing to get that sort of message out as well.
I should note GroupM's got its Back to News initiative that it started well over a year ago now. And yeah, it's a topic that we constantly harp on out. And of course, as journalists ourselves have an interest in. In terms of categories of advertisers, quickly, were there any categories that stood out to you as having a surprising outlook, I suppose, in terms of their predicted expenditure for next year?
Maybe not so much surprising. I think tech is going to be one for growth. It's coming back to that. You have folks like Lenovo and Dell talking about how much benefit they're getting from selling, AI-enabled technology. I think that'll continue to be the case for the next couple of years. We're at the point where we had this huge upgrade cycle right at the COVID pandemic recovery period. Everyone went out and bought hardware, and then there's been sort of this decline for the last couple of years where no one was upgrading, could be it all done at the same time. So I think we're now coming into that phase where people are going to be upgrading. Companies are going to be using AI software and built-in hardware to promote that upgrade, right? Mm-hmm. And so I see that as being an area of growth. I think one of the sort of fascinating categories in terms of just how much is changing right now is pharma and healthcare. Maybe over a slightly longer time horizon, right? Aging populations in various places, the rise of things like the GLP-1 drugs or for diabetes and weight loss, and that category is so interesting. You learn things every time you do this report. I learn things every time I do this report. The difference between a market like the US, where you have these big pharmacy chains, and Europe, where there are limitations. Sometimes I think it's Greece, where any entity can only own one pharmacy. And so things like retail for pharma advertisers in those European markets, it's non-existent because you don't have enough, it's just an entirely different system. So I think the pace of change, things like AI drug discovery, aging populations, that for pharma is going to be really interesting over the next 1 to 5 years.
And final question, because I know we're just about out of time. What's the one thing that we haven't mentioned that people should also be keeping a close eye on, especially in the first half of next year, to maybe get a signal for how the rest of the year and then further into the future might go?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm not even sure we'll get the outcome from some of you mentioned regulation. That's the first place that my head went. So to the extent we start seeing the impact or as these things take effect. I mean, you mentioned the Australia ban on social media for under 16s. That's not going to take effect until November. We may start to see the first elements of age verification and how that might be done, which would maybe give us a view in the early part of the year as to how likely that is to be rolled out more widely. That's one to watch for sure. And then the global space, China recovery and or in the commerce space, what's happening. Those, again, Asia-based e-commerce sellers are such a big piece of the pie for a company like Meta. And so also to the extent that you have in the US and Europe looks at de minimis or the customs standards for small packages, that's going to be interesting as well. But again, some of these could be on a much longer time horizon. So we'll see.
We're all just future gazing. Or forecasting, I guess, is the official word, right? Kate, we'll have to leave it there. As always, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you. And I'll see you next week. And anyone else who's at our event, we'll also get to see you next week. Thanks so much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Media Leader podcast. This episode was edited by our production partners, Trisonic. You can find and listen to all our episodes on our website at themedialeader.co.uk or wherever you get your podcasts. But just remember, please do subscribe to be notified when we release our next episode. From all of us at The Media Leader, I'm editor Omar Oakes. Our executive producer is Jack Benjamin. See you next time.